Welcome to Business Talk and the special sustainability series that's been brought to you by EY. And really dramatic changes to the global economic and geopolitical landscape over the last year have had an impact on the approach that countries are now taking to the COP27 climate negotiations, which kick off in just a few days' time in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And if you judge by what Environmental Affairs Minister Barbara Creecy was saying, she addressed local stakeholders on South Africa's expectations for the climate conference recently. She really said that developed countries should use COP27 to rebuild trust with developing nations by narrowing the gap between pledges and actual implementation. It really is all about that. And this week, the World Bank's climate report on South Africa estimated that the country is going to need $8.5 trillion between now and 2050 to meet the ambitious net zero goals that we've set for ourselves. And obviously lots of talk about the $8.5 billion Just Energy Transition IP, and I'm recording this just before that announcement. So sadly, we don't have all the details, but it's a great pleasure to be joined now by Joanne Yawitch, who's CEO of the National Business Initiative, the NBI, and also a member of the Inaugural Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Commission, the P4C. Joanne, great to have you on the show at this very important moment for South Africa and indeed the world. Firstly, could you just share with us a little bit more about the NBI and its purpose within this context?
Okay, thank you. Morning, Michael, and morning to your listeners. Sure. So the NBI is it's an old business organization, relatively speaking. It was formed in 1994 by President Mandela at that time to try and find a vehicle through which, in particular, big business could support the new democracy. And could invest both money and capacity and start to build a partnership between business and government in order to stabilize and take the country in a new development trajectory. So that's what its origins are. And so it's always been an organization that has been about the way that business interfaces with society and about the way that business can act responsibly in relation to the rest of society and government. And so that thread has informed the work of the NBI through all of its years. Currently, it is an organization that has around 100 company members, mainly large companies, but also some small and macro companies. Running across all sectors of the economy. And what we do is really support those companies in their endeavors to carry out their socio-economic and environmental programs and to support them in the way they take transformative initiatives forward. And what we try and do is to get businesses to work together across sectors and across the economy and within geographies so that you can demonstrate in a very practical way the kind of contribution that business can make to society. I think the other thing that we also do is that we also push business a bit in relation to trying to support it in taking forward initiatives in relation to transformation and change. And so we also deal with things like looking at internally what happens in corporates, done a lot of work around things like gender pay gaps. We run a program where we put retired business people in to mentor and support government officials. We run a big water, energy, and climate program.
And in fact, that's where I first met you, at the South African Water, Energy and Food Forum almost 20 years ago. Where did the time go? Now, it just shows you that you've got a lot of experience in this ESG sphere. Well, it wasn't ESG back then, but that's what it's become known as today. You were previously Deputy DG for Climate Change in the Department of Environmental Affairs. So your journey, I mean, you've watched this almost from a peripheral conversation now really move into the center of strategic priorities for boards. What inspired you to get into the ESG space?
Okay, so, that's an interesting question. I kind of have, throughout my career, kind of fallen into things. But I think the golden thread has really been, for me, it's always been a question of how do you do work that in some way or another is going to take society in a sustainable direction. I actually, my background really is in the land sector, and in the 80s and early 90s, working to support communities fighting forced removals, and then moved into the kind of conservation and environment space. But I do agree that when I first started working in this space, issues of sustainability were really seen as peripheral, green, bunny-hugging issues. And here we are sitting at something like COP27, where large numbers of world leaders are going to arrive in order to be able to engage on those issues. So it's been, you often don't see the progress until you look back over a decades-long period. And I think there has been progress. I also think there has had to be progress, certainly in the climate arena, as the kinds of impacts of climate change have started to become clear. And it's become clear that they spread right across the world. It's become a critical issue.
And it's such a critical issue. I was so heartened. Just recently, I was hosting the cyber conference, which is the Chartered Institute of Business Accountants. They've rebranded, but one of the guest speakers was the new MEC for Finance in Gauteng, Jacob Mamabelo, and he spoke about the opportunity in the green economy, green supply chain. What can we do around electric vehicles? And it's really infused into government thinking right now, which is hugely heartening. And you're also a part of the Presidential Climate Commission. Can you just tell us a bit more about the commission, the goals, and your role in this process?
Okay, so the commission actually came out of a decision in the job summit that was negotiated in Nedlac. I can't even remember the year, 2018, maybe 2019, where it was identified by all of the social partners, importantly, that climate change was a critical issue, and that it was an issue where there needed to be some kind of an institutional mechanism set up that would involve all of the social partners to work with government around it. And what came out of that was the Presidential Climate Commission, and its mandate really is a mandate around ensuring and giving advice in relation to the way that we take forward a just transition in South Africa. And the commissioners, interestingly, the commissioners on the commission include, firstly, a whole range of cabinet ministers, so government is represented at the highest level, but then people who are nominated from social partner constituencies, so from people who come out of business, labor, civil society, and government. And I think the main thing that the commission has done in the first period of its life has really been to run quite an in-depth consultative process around how we understand the concept of the just transition in South Africa. And that has culminated with the approval by Cabinet of the Just Transition Framework that really locates how we want to see this transition carried out within the context of justice, procedural, redistributive, other forms of justice. So that is what it's done. It has now got a program that is trying to say, having approved and developed this framework, what does it now mean to implement it? And so that is the role of the commission as an advisory body.
That's really where the rubber hits the road now in how do we implement it? Once we actually understand what we believe a just transition to mean, and not just a just energy transition, but a transition to this new economy that the world is trying to build at the moment, then how do we actually implement that? And I know the NBI, you've invested a lot of time and effort and resources into producing various reports on decarbonizing various industries within South Africa, mining, petrochemicals, chemicals, agriculture. Just tell us a little bit more about the work that you've done here and decarbonization, and how it's, in this context of a just transition, going to help us fight climate change.
Okay, so I'm sure that you know that the business community has increasingly become an informed player in relation to climate change. I mean, that work initially started with just disclosure of companies' carbon emissions, and then moved on to an understanding of how one then starts to decarbonize. There have been all kinds of initiatives taken by companies in relation to that. And I think in particular, as the investor movement internationally has signaled to companies in South Africa and everywhere else that they need to rapidly decarbonize, it's really become a central issue for companies, for boards and CEOs. In the context of the IPCC's findings that the world really needs to try and reach net zero carbon emissions by around 2050. We started to ask the question with our members as to whether really in South Africa it would be possible, given the fossil fuel intensive nature of our economy, whether it really would be possible for us to even contemplate getting to net zero by around 2050. And I say around 2050 because I think there is a big international debate about how a global carbon budget gets allocated and what is fair. So that is not a settled issue, and that obviously affects in dates. But so what we did is we got together a group of CEO champions that include many of the country's highest emitting companies, including companies like Eskom and Sasol, PPC, companies from the financial services sector, companies from the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector. And we've worked over a 2.5-year period with those CEOs in partnership with Business Unity South Africa and supported by Boston Consulting. And what we did was very systematically go through all of the critical economic sectors that would need to decarbonize. And we basically built evidence-based sets of scenarios that looked at whether we could move towards net zero by 2050. And our answer, essentially, having done all of this work and coming to the end of it, and we hope to launch a summarized and integrated view of the findings of the report at the COP, is that yes, we can. I mean, it is a hard ask. It's a long journey. It has significant and difficult implementation questions for South Africa, but it is not something that is not feasible at all. And it makes a huge amount of sense, particularly in the context of our current electricity supply shortages and what is going to need to be done in order to be able to address that. So that's on the one side. The other conclusion we came to is that this is an area of significant opportunity for the country. So if you look at the potential for building a green hydrogen economy, if you look at the potential for retrofitting our automotive industry, if you look at the extent to which there are elements of the renewables value chain that we could localize and start to reindustrialize in a different kind of way, there's an opportunity space that comes out of this that we think needs to be pursued, as on the one hand, you slowly phase the coal plants that are going to be decommissioned, phased down, and then you've got to bring in initially, given our current problems, you've got to bring in renewables very fast. And our conclusion is you've got to build renewables at a hugely rapid pace and at a much larger scale than we ever have over the next 20 or 30 years. And we've got to get on top of the new technology options, including storage options that will be rolled out worldwide. So essentially, that is the work that we have done. And as you say, there are multiple reports, but we are going to try and pull that all together. But I think importantly, what it has done is shown business leaders in South Africa that this is something that makes sense in terms of industrial strategy. It makes sense in terms of looking towards a viable future for the South African economy and for industry within that economy.
Well, it's such a complex area and so many strands within that. But I think at a very high and broad level, you need that ability to provide a vision to say that this is possible by 2050, because otherwise, and I've approached many skeptics in my various conversations who said, no, but 2050 is so far away. It's actually, it's been made this target that so far in the future that it can be put off by successive boards and management teams, and is not really achievable. But what you're saying is it is achievable. There are questions around who's going to be driving this. Is it going to be a market force approach? Is it just going to happen naturally? Will you need government to intervene to create new lead markets, potentially like we would in green steel or green hydrogen? And it's one of the unintended consequences of our energy crisis, that it has seen major listed companies starting to green their energy production. If you look at the REITs, they're all building solar on top of their assets and their roofs. If you look at the mining companies, they're building new renewable power plants. So that is one of the benefits of the Eskom crisis. But again, is it being market-led, and what are the roles here for the various role players? But I digress a little bit, because we've also got here the Sustainable Development Goals, and you've obviously, as the NBI, you've adopted those and the framework. So how does that dovetail with what we're doing here in this broad project of trying to build a future-proof, sustainable South African economy?
Okay, so I think that we've adopted, in fact, two things. The first is that the NBI has done quite a lot of work to look at how business supports the achievement of the National Development Plan, as well as looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and looking at how we achieve the SDGs, and what is it in the way that companies roll out their core strategies that enable them to support the aims of both the NDP and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've worked with particular sectors, in fact, and with companies around methodologies that enable them to assess what they are doing in relation to the SDGs and build them into their strategy. I think that where you've got to start, though, is to say that there is a strong business case for achieving and for focusing one's business around the need to achieve the SDG goals. Yeah. And really, if you look at a number of years ago, we put out a piece of work called Reimagining Africa. It was done with Accenture in the run-up to WEF Africa. And really what it did was to look at the business opportunity on the African continent in relation to socioeconomic and ESG issues. So, for example, there is a very low quality of healthcare in general across the African continent. It is a huge opportunity for the whole of the medical and health value chain. There is an enormous need to provide infrastructure across the continent. Again, a huge and significant opportunity for companies in the construction, the built environment, the engineering space. We've spoken about climate change and renewables. There are many countries across the continent energy poverty is a very serious problem across Africa. And so any kind of strategy to invest in energy infrastructure also needs to address energy poverty. And in addressing energy poverty, you then move towards the achievement of the SDG goals. So we think that for business, it makes huge sense to be able to focus on what are the unmet needs across the continent that require addressing, and then what is the role that business has to play in doing that, and how do you do it in a way that brings benefit to business, provides the services that people need, and does it in a way where benefits are spread across the board. So that is the approach that we have taken in relation to this, and I think that South African companies have really moved quite far forward in relation to some of the work that has been done to support small farmers and to bring them into the supply chains of large companies. If you look at the work done in the automotive industry in order to be able to build new Black-owned companies in the automotive supply chain. If you look at a wide range of initiatives across the corporate sector, including collective initiatives. So, for example, the work that B4SA and the Solidarity Fund did in the context of the COVID pandemic, you see that for business, it makes real sense to invest in these ESG and SDG-linked initiatives.
And it's all about impact at the end of the day. I was speaking of the motor industry, to Berenice Francis about how they've managed to unlock funding from Standard Bank that is based on their sustainability goals and journeys. And, the interest rate ratchets down or up depending on whether or not they meet their targets. So it really is a novel way and an interesting way that we're seeing finance being employed in this sense as well. But if you look at the NBI's impact, what sort of impact have you had as an organization since your establishment? And with that legacy in mind, what are you hoping for your future goals into 2030?
So I think that the NBI is very much an implementing and practical organization. But it has supported, I think, a whole lot of broad business initiatives over many years. So, for example, when the Business Trust was initially set up, which was the organization that called on companies to set aside 1% of after-tax profits and pool it in order to invest in societal programs. We ran that. We started the first big education outreach program trying to improve the quality of education. That is then, since there's now a whole world of educational institutions. We started working on climate change, as I said, in the early 2000s, when it was a very unfashionable and peripheral thing to be doing. And I think that we've now built a very successful and substantial program. We've worked across industry on things like energy efficiency. We've run some big water programs and run water partnerships, including having pulled business together to work with the city of Cape Town and the Western Cape province in the context of the Western Cape drought. We're seeing the work that we're doing to support governmental capacity taking traction. And then I think that keeping the internal transformation issues in companies at quite central in our agenda, as well as doing work around anti-corruption, has also been important. So I would like to think that we've played quite an important role in ensuring that these things aren't just seen as nice to have, so that the message goes out. They're absolutely core to your license to do business and to the way that you do business in South Africa, and you need to embed them in a very central way in strategy. Going forward, I'm 2030 kind of, on the one hand it's just around the corner, and on the other hand it's quite long term. Look, I think that the issues of inequity and inequality in South Africa have to be addressed, and I think that there's a big challenge for the corporate sector to be able to say what is its contribution to addressing that, and how far can we go, and can we put in place solutions that we haven't contemplated before. So I think that the issue of, certainly in relation to the work that we've been doing around 2050 net zero pathways, there's a very big challenge around taking these sectoral and integrated pathways and starting to say, how do we implement? And I think that we'll do a lot of work in the next year or two, including with provinces and municipalities, to support the kinds of partnerships that business can develop with government at all spheres, at all levels, in order to be able to get those paths, start doing the things, laying the basis for those pathways to be implemented, and supporting things we think that there's a huge potential for collective corporate renewable rollout initiatives working in partnership with government, with Eskom, with others. So I think that in some ways more of the same, but I think trying to scale up the direction that we're looking at. The one other area where we are scaling up quite significantly is in the SME development and youth employability space. And we have an economic inclusion program where we work with TVET colleges, with SMEs, with unemployed youth, with government, and with business. And what we do is we set up hubs linked to the TVET colleges, where we provide training for young people. We provide business support for SMEs. and then support young people to be employed by those SMEs, and then to find work within governmental and business supply chains. So, for example, just one example, during COVID, we ran a program where in Soweto, in partnership with the Gauteng Government and Department of Health, where we had SMEs employed to refurbish clinics and to refurbish hospital infrastructure. And they then in turn brought a whole lot of young people coming out of the TVET colleges in to implement those programs. And so you get this kind of virtuous circle. And that is a program that we hope to massively expand over the next decade or so. Yeah.
And it's fantastic to hear that, because you look at all the challenges, and if you reframe them, there are opportunities in South Africa. Infrastructure crumbling, yes, it's a challenge. It's also an opportunity and a way to do it, to leverage this strategic imperative to reduce inequality. Well, you do that by creating hope and employment for our youth and scaling up SMEs. So as you say, that virtuous circle, fantastic to hear, and much work still to be done, Joanne. So I'm going to let you go as you head into COP27. Great pleasure sharing your journey and your story and your goals here on Business Talk.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Michael. It's been great talking to you. Thanks. Bye.